Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little colder and a lot more personal. The kind of cold that seeps through your bones, creeps into your blankets and whispers you should have gone to bed earlier. Welcome to Victorian England, the frozen empire. The world where the simple act of falling asleep could feel like a test of faith. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open your eyes to a dim grey London morning. The kind of grey that doesn't just colour the sky, it eats the light whole. The windows of your narrow little flat are frosted over from the inside lace curtains stiff as parchment. Your breath blooms white in the air, curling like ghosts. The first sound you hear is not birdsong or laughter, but the crackle of ice shifting in the basin by your bed. Water, solid again. You sigh. You were supposed to wash with that. Outside, the world is quieter than usual, muffled by snow, strangled by cold. It's the late 1800s, one of the coldest winters on record, and London feels like it's been locked inside a frozen snow globe. Streets disappear beneath drifts of grey slush. The cobblestones glisten with ice, and somewhere a carriage wheel snaps like a bone. Horses snort clouds of vapour, their breath rising like steam engines. Somewhere you imagine the Thames itself is crusted with ice. Not thick enough to dance on, but thick enough to pretend you could. You pull the blanket tighter around your shoulders. Its wool heavy and scratchy enough to exfoliate your soul. Beneath it lies another, and another a sandwich of borrowed warmth. The mattress beneath you crunches faintly when you move. It's stuffed with straw that's seen better days and probably mice. If you were wealthy, you'd have a feather bed, a blazing hearth, maybe even a servant to warm your sheets. But you're not wealthy. You're just ordinary. And in the Victorian winter, ordinary means constantly negotiating with hypothermia. The air in your little room bites at your nose and the tips of your fingers. You try to tuck your hands beneath the blanket, but one arm is needed to keep it from slipping off. Victorian homes weren't designed for warmth. They were built for appearances, tall ceilings, wide halls, grand windows, all excellent at circulating one thing, cold air. Even in the middle-class districts, condensation freezes on the glass, and frost creeps up wallpaper like a living thing. You can almost hear it spreading a slow, crystalline invasion. You glance at the small fireplace by the wall. The embers died hours ago. A few grey coals glow faintly like old memories refusing to fade. You could get up and coax it back to life, but that would mean leaving the fragile cocoon of heat your body has built. You hesitate. Victorian mornings were like that, every decision weighed against the cost of losing warmth. A trip to the washstand. That's frostbite on your toes. Breakfast downstairs, brave but fatal. Maybe just lie here another minute. From the street below comes the distant sound of a newspaper boy, his voice half lost to the wind. Frost fair on the Thames. Freezing temperatures to continue, he calls. You imagine him a thin child wrapped in rags, shouting through chattering teeth, fingers red and cracked. Children worked through winters like this, running messages, selling matches, anything to earn a few pennies and maybe a piece of coal. Somewhere in the city, a factory whistle screams. The sound is sharp and mechanical, slicing through the silence like a blade. People will go to work. They always do. For the rich, of course, winter was an inconvenience, something to write about in letters. They had thick velvet drapes, roaring fires and servants who knew the art of keeping coals alive through the night. But even in the finest houses, the cold had a way of finding you. Aristocratic women wrapped themselves in fur-lined shawls, the smell of soot and perfume mingling in every corridor. Men huddled by the hearth with their brandy muttering about draughts and influenza. Outside chimney smoke hung thick in the air, the smell of survival. You imagine London from above. a grey ocean of rooftops, each exhaling a slow column of smoke into the sky. It's beautiful in a grim way, like watching a city breathe through its pores. The cold brings silence, but it also brings togetherness. You picture families huddled in one bed, parents, children, maybe a grandmother or two, all wrapped under the same wool blanket. The baby's breath steams softly, the father's arm draped over the group like a shield. The dog naturally has claimed the warmest spot by the feet. And then there are the others, the ones without beds, without walls. London's homeless were often found frozen on benches, their bodies discovered by lamplighters, making their rounds before dawn. Charitable societies set up soup kitchens and penny sits where, for the price of 1 coin, you could sit upright on a wooden bench in a warm room, not lie down, just sit. It was called charity. The workhouses were worse. You could sleep there if you were desperate, but you'd wake up to labour and sermons about sin. The poor didn't just fear hunger, they feared the cold itself, the silent thief that came in the night. And yet, even in that frozen darkness, there's something quietly human about it. People sharing their last bit of coal with a neighbour, a mother wrapping her child in her only shawl, a stranger tipping his hat, offering a candle stub to light your way home. The Victorian winter was cruel, yes, but it also revealed who people really were when everything else was stripped away. You shift again, feeling the weight of your own blanket. Somewhere deep in the fibres, the faint smell of smoke lingers your nightly perfume. You close your eyes for a moment and imagine that you're in one of those grand houses instead. Silk sheets, a fire burning low, the faint tick of a clock echoing in the hall. Outside, snow drifts softly against the window. For just a heartbeat, you can almost feel the warmth. Then a draught sneaks under the door and steals it away. The truth is, sleep in Victorian England wasn't about rest. It was about endurance. Every night was a negotiation with the cold, a contest between your heartbeat and the frost creeping closer. You didn't sleep through winter. You survived within it. And as the first rays of pale morning light crawl through the icy window, you realize something strange. You made it through another night. Your breath fogs the air, your toes still ache, but you're alive. And in the Victorian winter, that was miracle enough. London, in the full grip of winter, was both magnificent and merciless. By day, the city glittered beneath a thin crust of ice, sunlight bouncing off frozen rooftops like shards of broken glass. But by night it became something else, entirely quiet, smoky and spectral. You can almost see it now, the lamplighter making his slow rounds through the fog, each flame blooming faintly against the darkness, a fragile defiance against the cold. The air smells of soot, damp wool and frost, an oddly comforting mix that tells you in no uncertain terms that you're alive in the 19th century and your nose will probably never thaw again. The River Thames, that proud artery of empire, lies still and sullen. During the coldest years, like the Great Freeze of 1895, it froze almost solid. People came from miles away to gawk, laugh, and inevitably sell things. The British could turn anything into an event, even mass hypothermia. Booths sprang up across the ice, offering roasted chestnuts, gingerbread, and cheap gin for internal warmth. Children skated on makeshift blades nailed to their boots. Dogs chased after them, sliding out of control. And somewhere, inevitably, a vicar was preaching about the moral dangers of drinking outdoors while his breath crystallized mid-air. It was called a frost fair. Imagine it a temporary carnival built on ice, the ground beneath your feet groaning like an old ship. Tents, fluttering banners snapping in the wind. A fiddler soaring away at a tune, his fingers too numb to find the right notes. Young couples twirling clumsily, their laughter echoing down the frozen corridor of the Thames. It felt almost magical until the ice shifted, cracked like thunder, and everyone suddenly remembered that they were standing on a river pretending to be a street. The city's joy was fragile, the kind that existed only until the thaw. You wander along one of these fairs in your imagination, the cold biting at your face until it burns. A man sells hot eel pies from a smoking cauldron. The smell is alarming but warm. Another hawks miracle mittens that look suspiciously like old socks. A printer offers souvenir pamphlets stamped with the words "Printed on the Thames." You buy one just to prove you were there, though by the time you get home, the ink will have smeared from the damp. Still, there's something about standing in that cold shoulder to shoulder with thousands of strangers all laughing in defiance of the season. It's as if London, usually so proper, allowed itself one brief reckless dream before returning to its usual frostbitten dignity. But not everyone was laughing. For the poor, the freeze wasn't picturesque, it was punishment. The same river that hosted the Frost Fair also trapped barges and ships in place, cutting off coal deliveries. No coal meant no fire, and no fire meant no warmth, no cooking, and eventually no breath visible in the morning. Coal merchants grew rich. Chimney sweeps, sooty and coughing, worked from dawn to dark. The cold created an economy of suffering. If you were lucky, you could afford a few lumps of low-grade coal that smoked like a curse and left your ceiling black. If not, you scavenged what the rich discarded bits of burned wood, scraps of peat, or the faint warmth radiating from a neighbour's wall. And yet the city endured. It always did. Women stuffed newspaper into their boots to keep their toes from freezing. Men wrapped scarves around their heads like makeshift turbans, muttering about continental nonsense while shivering uncontrollably. Even the horses wore blankets. In every alleyway you could hear the same chorus, the rhythmic coughing of Londoners breathing soot and winter in equal measure. Doctors called it the fog, as if it were a weather pattern, and not the entire city slowly asphyxiating under its own progress. Indoors, the battle continued. In cramped tenements, families slept huddled together for warmth, their breath forming tiny clouds above them. Frost crept across the inside of window panes like delicate white vines turning glass into lace. Mothers placed bricks by the fire until they glowed red, then wrapped them in rags to slip under the covers primitive hot water bottles that scorched more than they soothed. Children wore mittens to bed and dreamed of tropical colonies they'd never see. The fire hissed, the wind moaned in the chimney, and sleep came slowly, if at all. In wealthier homes, things weren't quite as dire, but the struggle was the same, just more politely disguised. Servants rose before dawn to light the household fires, moving silently through icy corridors with buckets of coal. Upstairs, lords and ladies complained of draughts, while sipping cocoa beside their ornate hearths. Their blankets were thick, their curtains lined with fur, but the cold found them anyway. It seeped under doors, coiled in stairwells, and settled in their bones. The Victorians were obsessed with propriety, but no amount of etiquette could hide the sound of teeth chattering. The newspapers loved the spectacle. Thames frozen, the headlines screamed. Carriages crossed the river. They called it romantic, an adventure in ice. But for those sleeping under bridges, romance was just another word for exposure. You picture them now. A man wrapped in rags curled beneath a half-collapsed arch, his breath rising faintly in the dark. The frost forms a halo around his beard. He's dreaming of spring, or maybe of nothing at all. Historians still argue whether the coldest Victorian winters truly strengthened the British character, or merely numbed it. Either way, they defined an era. Painters captured the beauty of the frost. Poets compared it to purity and decay. The cold was not just weather, it was metaphor. It shaped the way Victorians thought about endurance, about morality, about the thin line between survival and pride. Even the language changed. Warmth became a virtue. Hearth became a symbol. And when people spoke of comfort, they didn't mean luxury, they meant life itself. You breathe out slowly, watching the mist fade into the candlelight. For a moment, it's easy to forget this is history. The images feel too real, the cracked hands, the smoky breath, the hush of snow falling on cobblestones. But that's the strange thing about Victorian London. It wasn't just a city, it was an organism breathing, coughing, shivering, dreaming. It endured frost plague, soot and silence, and somehow it kept its heart beating beneath all that ice. So as the frost thickens on your imagined window, and the sound of distant carriage wheels fades into the night, you pull the blanket higher. The room smells faintly of coal and candle wax. Somewhere a clock ticks like a heartbeat. Outside London sleeps cold, weary, and stubbornly alive. And you, lying there in the dim warmth of your own modern bed, realize that maybe you're not so different. The world is still cold sometimes. We still huddle for warmth, still crave the glow of light in the dark. You close your eyes. The past drifts closer, whispering through the cracks. The frozen river, the smoky hearth, the quiet resilience of people who refused to surrender to winter. You can almost hear them breathing beside you, their dreams still rising in the frost. By now you can almost feel it, that crisp, biting chill that lived inside every brick and bone of the Victorian world. The night deepens and the air feels heavier, sharper, as though it's learned how to cut. You stand by the window watching the glow of gas lamps blur behind a thin crust of frost. They shimmer like distant stars, each one trembling in the wind. This is London wrapped in ice and stubbornness. And tonight, we step out into it. You push open the door and the cold greets you, instantly slipping down your collar like a thief. The street crunches underfoot. Every sound, the echo of boots, the creak of carriage wheels, the distant bark of a dog feels amplified in the stillness. Even your breath seems too loud, a small puff of defiance against the endless grey. Somewhere nearby, a newspaper blows across the cobblestones, frozen in mid-crumple like a fossil of bad news. For the people who lived here, winter wasn't scenery. It was a daily duel. The city never slept, but it did slow its pulse heavy, its movements deliberate. The morning commute was less about being punctual and more about staying alive. Workers trudged through ankle-deep slush, their faces hidden behind scarves, their boots leaking at the seams. The fog mixed with coal smoke until the air turned thick and yellow, the famous London pea soup, equal parts atmosphere and lung hazard. The richer citizens called it picturesque. The poor just called it coughing season. In the market squares, vendors stamped their feet and blew on their hands, trying to keep blood moving while hawking cabbages, matches and miracles. A woman sells roasted chestnuts from a dented tin pan. The smell is sweet, smoky, comforting the scent of endurance. Children linger near the coals, pretending to help just to catch the heat. Somewhere, a man plays a battered violin, its notes thin and wavering in the cold air. The song doesn't sound joyful. It sounds like someone trying to remember what joy once felt like. You pass a row of houses identical and sombre. Behind the curtains, faint flickers of orange reveal small fireplaces, tiny pockets of warmth struggling against the dark. Some glow strong, others barely shimmer. Heat was a privilege. Coal wasn't cheap, and poor families learned to make every ember last. They would burn anything that caught scraps of paper, bits of furniture, even the remains of old boots. Better smoke than silence, people said, half joking, half true. Inside one of these homes, a mother hunches by the hearth, coaxing life from a few stubborn coals. Her children sleep nearby, buried beneath layers of patched blankets. The baby's breath fogs in the air. The mother's hands are cracked red raw from washing clothes in icy water. She watches the fire die, down each spark fading like a tiny star. There's a moment of hesitation before she rises, walks to the door, and tears a slat from a broken chair. The chair groans. She winces. But the fire flares to life again, and for tonight that's enough. Meanwhile, across town, the upper class prepare for their winter evenings with ritual precision. In grand drawing rooms lined with velvet drapes, servants pour wine beside roaring fires. A pianist plays something gentle, perhaps. A waltz while conversation hums beneath chandeliers. The ladies' jewels catch the light, the men laugh about politics, and someone inevitably remarks that the cold makes the air so crisp. None of them think about the laundress who pressed their linens with frozen hands, or the coachman outside shivering on the box while snow piles on his shoulders. The contrast was absurd and very Victorian. Comfort didn't erase the cold. It simply disguised it in lace and manners. Even in warmth there was performance. The polite smile, the cheerful toast, the unspoken awareness that outside those gilded walls people were dying quietly under bridges. The city had a way of keeping both truths alive at once, elegance and agony side by side. You keep walking. Down a narrow alley smoke seeps from a baker's chimney. The smell of bread slices through the frost like a kind of mercy. The baker's face is flushed from heat and exhaustion. He's been awake since before dawn, kneading dough in a room barely large enough for a grown man to turn around. Flour dusts his hair like snow. He glances up, meets your eyes for half a second and smiles. You nod. In the Victorian world, small warmths mattered, the kind, exchanged wordlessly before the cold could catch them. A few streets over the Thames lie still black and half frozen again. The water moves sluggishly beneath thin plates of ice. Lanterns bob along its banks, their reflections fractured by the current. Bargemen huddle by makeshift fires, their breath rising in ghostly shapes. One man hums an old song, something about home or maybe the idea of it. It's hard to tell. The sound drifts across the water, fragile but persistent, like the city itself. You wonder how anyone slept through nights like these. The answer, of course, is simple. They didn't sleep through them. They slept inside them, wrapped in shawls, beside fading fires, listening to the city breathe. The rhythm of survival became a lullaby. You could almost hear it, the tick of the clock, the sigh of the wind, the soft crackle of wood surrendering to flame. Each sound meant you were still here. Each sound meant you hadn't frozen yet. Victorian doctors wrote entire manuals about how to sleep properly in the cold. Their advice ranged from practical to ridiculous. Warm your feet with mustard poultices. Drink port wine before bedwear. Flannel underwear embroidered with moral quotes. Some suggested keeping a dog at the foot of the bed, not for companionship, but for heat. A faithful creature's warmth, one physician wrote, may prevent the chill of midnight death, comforting in the bleakest possible way. Still, there was beauty in it, the kind that only hardship can carve. Frost flowers blooming on window panes, the hush of snow falling over gaslight, the sudden fierce intimacy of sharing warmth with another person. Love in the Victorian winter wasn't candlelight and poetry. It was someone handing you the last brick from the fire. The cold changed people, yes, but it also bound them. It forced Londoners, rich and poor alike, to recognise the fragility they all shared. Beneath the soot, the etiquette and the hierarchy, everyone had the same red hands, the same white breath, the same small hope for morning. You turn back toward home. The fog thickens, swallowing the lamplight, until it feels like you're walking through a painting that's slowly fading. Somewhere behind you, a carriage wheel rattles. Somewhere ahead, a door slams against the wind. When you finally step back inside your little room, it's still cold, but now the quiet feels different. The kind of silence that knows it's earned. You crawl beneath the blanket, pull it over your head and listen. The city murmurs faintly outside, a low, steady heartbeat beneath layers of ice. And for one soft, fleeting moment you understand what it meant to live through those winters, not to conquer the cold, but to outlast it one breath at a time. If you think the Victorians faced winter with grace and composure, you'd only be half right, because behind the polished manners and the stoic British keep-calm attitude was a society perpetually shivering inside its own homes. You'd imagine a fireplace in every room, a cosy orange glow, people sipping tea by the hearth. But in reality, most Victorian houses were freezing, fancier versions of iceboxes with wallpaper. The walls might have been grandly decorated, but they leaked heat like gossip through the servants' corridor. You step into one of these houses, and the illusion of warmth immediately collapses. The entrance hall feels like the inside of a stone tomb. Cold air curls down the staircase, pooling at your feet. The marble floor, so elegant in summer, now feels like an act of revenge from the underworld. Servants scuttle past carrying coal scuttles and candles, their breath visible, their footsteps echoing against the walls. Somewhere upstairs a draught whistles through a half-open window, rattling the frame like a ghost, demanding attention. The problem wasn't just temperature, it was architecture. Victorian homes were built for status, not comfort. High ceilings were fashionable, meant to display chandeliers and wealth, but all they really did was let the heat rise away from the people trying to enjoy it. Long hallways and tall, narrow windows created the perfect wind tunnels for cold air to invade, and insulation practically non-existent. Wallpaper, wood paneling and heavy drapes might look cozy in paintings, but they couldn't compete with the bone-deep chill that seeped through every seam of brick and mortar. If you were rich, you might at least have a coal fireplace in multiple rooms, each one attended by a servant armed with a poker and a schedule. But even then, only the rooms in use were heated. Hallways, stairwells and bathrooms were left to the mercy of the elements. Guests often carried small hand warmers, metal cases, filled with smoldering charcoal to keep from freezing during dinner parties. Meanwhile, in less affluent homes, families gathered in a single room around a single fire, rationing both coal and conversation until morning. You imagine sitting by that fire now. It crackles, but not warmly. It's a brittle, hungry sound. The coals glow sullen red, too weak to fill the space with light. The smell of soot clings to everything, clothes, curtains, even your dreams. The air tastes faintly metallic. You pull your chair closer until your knees start to sting, but your back remains icy. The fire never seems to reach the corners of the room. Victorian fireplaces were notoriously inefficient. Half of the heat shot straight up the chimney, as if escaping in protest. Historians still argue whether the Victorians were genuinely tougher or simply too polite to complain. Letters from the time are filled with subtle hints. "The chill lingers," still writes one housewife from Yorkshire, "though I have burned through this week's coal allowance by Thursday." Another woman notes that her ink froze solid on the desk before she could finish her letter. Servants reported sleeping in attic quarters so cold that water in the wash basins turned to ice overnight. Yet somehow they rose before dawn dressed in layers of wool and linen and went about lighting fires for others. Imagine those early mornings, the hush before sunrise, the smell of damp ash from the night before. The maid kneels by the hearth, fingers trembling as she arranges kindling. Her breath clouds the air, her knuckles are white. The coal scuttle is nearly empty. She strikes the flint once, twice, and at last a spark catches. The fire begins its slow resurrection, a fragile flicker against the immense cold. She warms her hands for just a second, just one stolen moment of heat before hurrying to the next room. The wealthy homeowners, of course, rarely thought about where their warmth came from. They complained when it was too smoky, too dim, too late, but never paused to imagine the frostbitten servants crawling out of unheated quarters to make it happen. Comfort, in the Victorian sense, always came at someone else's expense. In poorer households, fireplaces were a patchwork of ingenuity. Some burned peat, others bits of broken furniture or whatever wood could be scavenged. Chimneys were rarely swept, and smoke often billowed back into the room. Eyes watered, lungs burned, and ceilings turned black. But still, people huddled close, grateful for any warmth at all. The smell of smoke meant life. And it wasn't just people who fought for warmth. Houses themselves seemed to wage small wars against the cold. The wallpaper peeled slightly from the damp. Floorboards creaked, as if groaning from the strain. Even iron bed frames grew frosty to the touch, biting bare skin like teeth. Some people lined their walls with newspaper, or hung thick tapestries just to slow the drafts. Others stuffed rags under doors or glued bits of felt around window frames. It wasn't pretty, but it worked sometimes. Even the middle-class proud and practical couldn't escape the cold. Doctors wrote in medical journals about the chill of the domestic dwelling as a cause for everything from arthritis to melancholy. Housewives wrote recipes not just for food but for heat, how to make economical coal balls out of ash sawdust, and old molasses pressed together like desperate snowballs for the hearth. There was a certain art to staying warm without spending a fortune, and the British ever inventive turned it into a kind of grim pastime. Meanwhile, children made games out of their suffering. They'd hover their hands over the kettle and giggle at the steam or take turns sitting nearest the fire like players in a dangerous round of musical chairs. The older ones learned tricks keeping bricks by the hearth during the day, then tucking them into bed at night or rubbing soap on the soles of their boots to repel snow. Little rituals of survival passed down through generations, as ordinary as saying grace before dinner. But the truth, even the best fire couldn't truly conquer the cold. It was always there waiting. It lived in the corners, in the walls, in the space between breaths. You could fight it for hours, and still wake up in the middle of the night to find your pillow rimmed with frost. Victorians grew used to it. The shiver became a rhythm. The ache in their fingers became a kind of prayer. And perhaps that's why they romanticized winter so fiercely. In the newspapers and novels, the season was painted as poetic, a time for introspection, for endurance, for quiet strength. It wasn't just weather, it was character building. The cold became moral proof. If you could sleep through a Victorian winter, then surely you were made of better stuff than those living in tropical colonies with their endless sun and soft habits. You step back from the fire now, watching the flames dance faintly against the soot-blackened wall. It's not much, but it's something, a heartbeat of heat in an indifferent world. And for the Victorians that was enough. They didn't need comfort. They needed continuity. A fire that stayed alive through the night was more than warmth. It was a promise that morning would come, and the house, no matter how cold, would still be standing. Outside, snow begins to fall again, soft and slow. You listen to it tapping against the window like fingertips. The fire crackles dim but defiant, and in that sound, the hiss of coal, the sigh of smoke, you hear the heartbeat of an entire century refusing to freeze. By the time the Victorian evening settled in, people had perfected the art of layering. Not layering as a fashion statement, but as a matter of survival, the kind that determined whether you'd wake up in the morning or be found frozen into a polite historical anecdote. In winter London, no one trusted a single garment to do the job alone. Every outfit was an onion of desperation, cotton, linen, wool, flannel, and occasionally faith. You start with the basics, a thin undershirt if you're lucky made of linen. It's scratchy, but it's the foundation. Over that, another shirt. Then a waistcoat, a heavy overcoat, and perhaps another coat just for good measure. Men wrapped wool scarves tight around their necks until they looked like polite mummies with good posture. Women, on the other hand, faced a far crueler fate. Victorian fashion demanded that they maintain elegance even in frostbite territory. Imagine it corsets laced so tightly you could barely breathe, let alone shiver. Layers of petticoats, underskirts, overskirts and crinolines, so wide you could trap a small dog beneath them and never know. Then came the gloves, the shawl, the bonnet, and if fortune smiled on you, a fur-lined cloak. By the time a woman was fully dressed, she was roughly 1/3 fabric, 1/3 human, and 1/3 complaint. Historians estimate that an upper-class woman might wear up to 15 pounds of clothing at once, and still she'd whisper, "I can't feel my toes." But this layering wasn't just vanity, it was a ritual. Each garment added a thin, fragile layer of defense against the cold that seeped into every street and every bone. There was even a phrase for it, bundling up, which sounds cozy until you realize that people did it indoors too. Entire families spent winter evenings sitting in their parlors, wearing coats, hats, and gloves, as though perpetually prepared to evacuate. Children wore hand-me-downs, so patched they looked like fabric mosaics. They didn't complain, though. The cold taught discipline fast. Wool stockings were pulled up high, and secured with string mittens were attached to sleeves by rope to prevent loss, and boots were stuffed with straw for insulation. If your shoes leaked, you lined them with newspaper. And if the ink bled onto your socks, well, at least your feet stayed readable. The middle class, forever aspiring upward, clung to fashion even when it made no sense. Men insisted on stiff collars and polished shoes, even as sleet soaked through them. Women wore silk gloves to church, the kind that froze solid by the time the sermon ended, and yet appearances mattered. A gentleman might be blue in the face, but he'd rather die of pneumonia than admit to wearing thermal undergarments. Dignity apparently was warmer than wool. The working class had a different strategy. They layered not for style, but for combat. Old shirts, frayed shawls, bits of blanket, anything that could trap air between fibres was valuable. Wool was ideal but expensive. So many relied on shoddy cloth, a recycled fabric made from shredded rags. It smelled faintly of every previous owner, but it was warm enough to get you through the night. A dock worker might wear 3 jackets at once, a cap pulled low and gloves with the fingertips cut off for grip. You could spot him in the morning fog steaming slightly like a walking chimney. Even sleepwear became an act of engineering. Nightshirts were long and thick, often worn over full undergarments. Wool socks were essential, and a nightcap wasn't just decoration, it kept the head from losing precious heat. The average Victorian went to bed looking like a cross between a chimney sweep and an elderly ghost. Couples who shared a bed did so less for romance than efficiency. 2 bodies under 1 blanket were warmer than one, and love, as it turned out, had a surprisingly practical side. But the real tragedy was what they couldn't layer their homes. The draft never stopped. You could wear every piece of clothing you owned and still feel the cold crawling in. It came through the keyholes, through the cracks in the windows, through the very walls. Some people swore they could hear it whispering at night, sneaking into their dreams. Doctors, ever fond of advice, offered their own ideas for winter wear. Some recommended rubbing yourself down with goose fat before dressing to seal the pores and maintain natural warmth. Others suggested wrapping flannel around the chest to guard the lungs against miasma. One enthusiastic writer in an 1864 pamphlet claimed that a layer of red flannel directly upon the skin is the surest guardian of life. No one could explain why it had to be red, but apparently fashion and superstition made fine bedfellows. Of course, all those layers had side effects. People fainted. Constant compression from corsets and heavy coats made breathing difficult, especially indoors where fires filled the air with smoke. Doctors began diagnosing winter fainting, a polite way of saying that someone had passed out from being too fashionable in freezing weather. Women were the usual victims, though men weren't immune. One satirical magazine from the 1870 seconds even published a cartoon of a gentleman tipping over in his overcoat captioned "Frozen in the attitude of refinement." Despite the misery, there was something oddly unifying about it. Everyone suffered together, the rich in silk, the poor in rags, all layered like onions against the same merciless chill. Streets full of bundled figures moved slowly through the fog, faces, hidden voices muffled. It was anonymity by necessity. Beneath the fabric, everyone looked the same, fragile and determined. And then there was the smell. Layers of wool and damp fabric created a distinct musk that even Victorians couldn't ignore. Laundry was a luxury in winter. Water froze in the basins and drying clothes indoors took days. So garments were worn again and again until they developed what polite society called an earthy fragrance. In other words, people smelled like their houses' smoke, coal, wet, wool, and effort. Still, the ritual of dressing for the cold carried a kind of poetry. Every button fastened was a small act of defiance. Every scarf tied was a whispered prayer to see spring again. The Victorians didn't have central heating or insulated boots, but they had stubbornness, and stubbornness is its own kind of warmth. As you picture yourself standing there, boots crusted with snow gloves, stiff with frost, you can almost feel the weight of their world. The layers pressed close, heavy, yet reassuring, like armor against an indifferent sky. You take a breath, and for a moment the air feels sharp and pure. The city hums beneath its icy shell, and you understand something simple but profound. In Victorian England, survival was style, and every thread told a story. So tonight, as you pull your own blanket tighter, remember them, the women laced into gowns that could stop their circulation, the men buried in coats that smelled of smoke, the children wrapped in scraps of memory, all of them facing the same eternal question that winter asks of everyone: how much warmth can a human heart create before the cold winds? When the sun finally dipped beneath the grey horizon, that was when the true test began. The hours of sleep, or rather the hours of trying to convince your body to sleep while the air itself tried to kill you. In Victorian England, bedtime wasn't peaceful. It was tactical. It was preparation for an 8-hour siege. You start by warming the bed, not a luxury but a survival necessity. The process was both clever and mildly hazardous. Some households used a bed wagon, a wooden frame filled with glowing coals or heated stones, slid under the sheets an hour before bedtime to take the chill off. It often worked, unless, of course, the wagon caught fire, which was not uncommon. Others preferred hot bricks wrapped in rags and placed at the foot of the bed. If you were slightly wealthier, you might own a bed warmer, a brass pan with a long handle filled with embers and swirled beneath the sheets. It hissed and smoked, filling the room with that familiar perfume of soot and singed linen. But the most famous method, and the most beloved, was the invention of the hot water bottle. Early versions weren't the soft rubber kind we know today. They were made of ceramic or metal, heavy and occasionally leaky. Yet for those few hours of warmth, people would risk scalded toes without hesitation. Some families even gave them nicknames, treating them like little household pets. "Pass me the kettle, pup," someone might joke before tucking it under the covers. In a world where heating an entire house was impossible, you learned to heat a very small corner of it, instead the one that held your body. You'd climb into bed slowly, like entering an ice bath. The first touch of linen was shocking, cold, stiff, almost brittle. Blankets were layered thickly wool, then quilt, then more wool. If you were lucky, there was a feather-filled comforter on top, soft as it was rare. The goal was to trap every ounce of heat your body made and not let it escape. Once cocooned, movement was forbidden. Shift too much and you'd lose the fragile warmth your skin had fought to build. Couples shared beds not from affection but arithmetic. 2 bodies were warmer than one. Entire families might share the same mattress, parents, children, even grandparents stacked like a human lasagna beneath the quilts. It wasn't romantic and it wasn't particularly clean, but it worked. There were even manuals on efficient sleeping arrangements, advising families to rotate positions every few hours so no one froze on the outer edges for too long. If you woke up with your sister's elbow in your ribs, or your grandfather's snore in your ear, well, that was the price of survival. The poor, of course, didn't have proper beds. Straw mattresses were common, stuffed into wooden frames or directly onto the floor. The straw flattened over time, became damp, and sometimes began to rot. Fleas and lice thrived in the warmth of human bodies, and every scratch during the night was a small reminder that comfort was a myth. In the coldest months, people slept fully dressed, boots and all. Some huddled beside livestock for warmth, the animal's breath creating clouds of shared survival. A cow's slow exhalation could mean the difference between waking up and never waking up again. Even for the middle class, sleep was rarely tranquil. Bedrooms weren't heated. Only the fire in the parlour was allowed to burn late into the night. Once you climbed the stairs, each step creaked like a warning. The air grew colder, drier, The candle flame trembled. In the small hours, the temperature dropped to its lowest, and you'd feel it, the kind of cold that found your bones, the kind that felt personal. Breath turned to frost on the window pane. Sometimes it froze to your pillow. Historians describe these nights almost tenderly, Victorian endurance in the face of winter's cruelty. But living it would have been far less poetic. Your nose hurt. Your fingers ached. You lay there half asleep, listening to the faint pop of cooling wood and the slow, steady drip of melting frost from the ceiling beams. If the fire downstairs died, the cold would start creeping up the stairwell, rolling through the halls like invisible fog. The family dog might sense it first, shifting restlessly before curling into a tighter ball. And then there were the sounds, the strange symphony of winter houses, timber groaning under frost, the occasional crack of ice breaking loose from the roof, rats scurrying through the walls seeking their own warmth. You'd pull the blanket over your ears and try to imagine something else. Summer fields, sunlight, the faint scent of lilac. But inevitably the cold pulled you back. Even the act of breathing was an event. The air burned your lungs dry and sharp. Some Victorians placed damp cloths near their beds to moisten the air, an early and mostly futile attempt at humidification. Others believed sleeping with the window cracked was healthier, claiming fresh air built moral character, though this was mostly said by doctors with better fireplaces than their patients. The wealthy had a few extra tricks. Heated footrests under the covers, furs draped across beds. Some even used warming pans filled with sand instead of coals to avoid fires. There were stories of eccentric aristocrats who had servants sleep in adjoining rooms with their doors open just to radiate an extra hint of body heat into the master's chamber. Human insulation, one servant reportedly called it, a grim but efficient phrase. In boarding houses and dormitories, nights were a communal affair. 10, sometimes 20 people to a room, the air thick with breath and whispers. No one complained much. It was cheaper to share warmth than to pay for coal. In letters from the era, travellers often remarked on the odd intimacy of Victorian lodging. Strangers falling asleep side by side, the sound of unfamiliar breathing blending into a single rhythm. For a few hours, poverty made them equals. And yet, despite the hardship, there was ritual, even beauty in the bedtime struggle. Parents tucked children in with soft murmurs, lit candles guttering low. Lovers shared whispered goodnights before vanishing into their separate rooms. In that fragile silence, when the fire's last ember glowed like a heartbeat in the grate, there was a sense of peace, a fragile peace carved out of endurance. Historians still argue whether the Victorians truly slept better or simply collapsed from exhaustion. Between the physical cold, the poor insulation, and the unrelenting noise of a living, breathing city, it's a wonder anyone dreamed at all, and yet they did. Letters, diaries, and poems speak of vivid dreams during winter nights, of wandering through gardens of warm sunlight of home. Perhaps the mind desperate to escape the cold created warmth in the only place it could. So as you picture yourself lying there, a mountain of quilts over your chest, a brick at your feet, a candle flickering its last, remember that sleep in the Victorian age was not just rest, it was rebellion. Against the wind, the frost, the hunger, the endless dark. Each breath was an act of defiance, each dream a small victory over the cold world outside. And when morning came pale and reluctant, they rose again, tired, half-frozen, but alive. Because that, more than anything else, was what winter demanded, not comfort, not cheer, but the quiet, stubborn miracle of still being here. If the Victorian bedroom was a battlefield against cold, then the coal fire was its only weapon, a moody, smoky, unpredictable ally that might save you or silently kill you in your sleep. Coal was the lifeblood of the era. It powered factories, trains, and cities, but it also powered something far more personal: survival through winter nights. Every flicker of orange light in those dark London rooms came from the same black dust that built the empire and blackened its lungs. You can picture it now, a small fire, struggling in a grate surrounded by iron, the glow reflecting off soot-stained tiles. The flame dances weakly shifting from red to gold to a deep, sickly blue. Someone crouches beside it, coaxing it to life, with a poker whispering encouragement, the way you'd speak to a pet. Fires were alive back then, temperamental, hungry, needing constant attention. Let your mind wander too long, and it would die with a hiss, leaving only cold ash and regret. But coal fires were double-edged miracles. The warmth they offered came at a cost most people didn't understand until they felt it burning in their throats. In tightly sealed Victorian homes, the air turned thick with carbon monoxide, though no one knew the name. They called it the black sleep when a person drifted off near the fire and never woke again. It happened quietly, no struggle, no sound. Just a slow dimming, as if the room itself decided to take back its borrowed warmth. It wasn't just gas that killed, it was the soot. The chimneys belched black smoke that settled on every surface. Curtains, yellowed walls, darkened lungs filled. Londoners joked that you could tell the age of a home by how much grime it wore, like geological layers of progress. The city sky was never truly blue. It hovered between grey and sepia, a permanent twilight painted by coal. By the mid-1800s, people began to call it the London fog, as though naming it made it poetic instead of deadly. And yet people loved their fires. They gave the illusion of control a tiny sun in a city of ice. Families gathered around them like worshippers at a shrine. It wasn't just heat, it was hope. The soft crackle became the evening soundtrack. Mothers told stories while stirring pots over the flames. Children stared into the glow, imagining castles or dragons. Men dozed in chairs, pipes in hand, their faces half-lit like old oil portraits. The fire turned strangers into families and silence into comfort. But maintaining that warmth was work, endless, messy, dangerous work. Every household burned through buckets of coal each week, and it wasn't cheap. Poor families often had to choose fuel or food. There were grim jokes about dinner by the hearth, meaning boiled smoke and nothing else. Street vendors sold sacks of slack coal dust mixed with dirt at a discount, but it barely burned, and filled rooms with choking clouds. Women scraped the ashes for unburnt fragments, pressing them into small coal balls with water and clay to reuse. Nothing went to waste, not even despair. Servants bore the worst of it. The morning ritual began long before dawn. A maid crept through cold halls, shovel and brush in hand, collecting the previous night's ashes. She'd empty them into metal bins, sweep the hearth, and lay a new fire for her masters. Her lungs stung with each breath of soot. Her apron turned grey by sunrise. Sometimes she'd sneak a few embers to her own quarters upstairs, hoping to coax a bit of stolen warmth before it went cold again. Then there were the chimneys themselves, narrow, filthy tunnels that needed constant cleaning. Young boys, often orphans, were forced to climb them, scraping soot with bare hands and rags. They coughed their lives away for pennies. Historians still argue about which was crueler, the cold that drove them to work, or the smoke that slowly killed them. Either way, the Victorian fire burned brighter because someone smaller fed it. Even in wealthy homes, fire was fickle. A burst of wind could send sparks flying, setting curtains alight. Chimneys could clog and smoke back into rooms. In old letters, homeowners described nights spent choking upon our own comfort. Doctors began diagnosing soot cough, a persistent wheeze that came to define the London voice. Still, no one dared abandon their hearth. The alternative was worse, a house gone silent, breath turning to frost. At night, the fire became both friend and threat. The last embers were banked covered with ash to preserve their heat until morning. A well-banked fire meant survival. A poorly banked one could smoulder and fill the room with invisible poison. People learned to sleep lightly, half listening to the faint hiss of coal. If it went quiet, you woke up in panic to restart it. There was comfort in that low glow, but also fear. You loved the fire, but you never trusted it. The smell of coal clung to everything: hair, fabric, dreams. People would wake with soot on their pillows, the taste of metal on their tongues. Visitors from the countryside wrote home in shock. I blew my nose this morning, and it came out black, while Londoners shrugged. To them, the smoke was the city. It was progress. It was the sound of industry roaring through the night, keeping them alive, one spark at a time. Still, every now and then something strange would happen. A gust of wind would blow through a chimney, and the flame would flicker blue, casting ghostly light across the walls. Superstitious Victorians said it meant a soul was passing nearby the fire, bowing in respect. In truth, it was just gas, maybe a bit of damp coal burning oddly. But in a city that had turned survival into ritual, even science needed its ghosts. The wealthy, ever inventive, found ways to make the fire fashionable. Fireguards of polished brass, ornate mantles, decorative screens painted with hunting scenes or angels. Guests were invited to sit close to admire the glow, to discuss poetry while pretending not to cough. There was even etiquette, for it never warm your back to the fire in company, and never under any circumstance roast your hands like a tradesman. Warmth was a social performance, choreographed like a dance. And yet, beneath all that civility, there was something primal about those fires. They crackled with the same defiance as the people who tended them. In the silence of a Victorian night, when the wind howled down narrow streets and the world felt colder than reason, that little flicker in the grate meant everything. It meant life. You can almost hear it now. The low sigh of burning coal, the soft rhythm of breath beside it. A faint warmth spreads through the room, just enough to thaw your fingers. It's imperfect, smoky, fragile, but it's enough. It always was. For every Victorian who laid down to sleep, that ember in the hearth was both a promise and a prayer. A reminder that no matter how deep the frost grew, no matter how long the night stretched, someone would always keep burning. By the time the last coals in the hearth sank to grey, most Victorians had already crawled into their nests of blankets. But warmth was never guaranteed. Sleeping in winter meant more than resting. It meant fighting off the cold like a polite, silent war. Each night was a small experiment in survival, and every layer, every ritual was part of that fragile defence. You can imagine it now. A small bedroom. The wallpaper faded, its floral pattern barely visible by candlelight. The air is so cold you can see your breath, a little ghost hovering in the dark. A narrow bed sits against the wall, piled with quilts, so heavy it feels like sleeping under history itself. Somewhere in the room, a faint draught hums through the cracks in the window frame, whispering secrets from the icy street outside. In that world, sleep wasn't indulgence, it was endurance. People prepared for it like travellers setting out on a dangerous journey. The routine began early. You'd undress quickly, shivering in the half-dark, then slip into a long flannel nightshirt that hung like a soft tent. Some wore woolen stockings to bed. Others wrapped their feet in cloth, soaked in vinegar or whiskey, convinced it stimulated the circulation. The more inventive types tucked hot potatoes into their socks. If that sounds absurd, remember warmth was a currency, and people spent it however they could. Nightcaps were essential, those soft, ridiculous hats that cartoons still mock. But they weren't fashion statements. They were thermal armour. Without one, the body lost precious heat through the scalp, and by dawn your head could feel like a frozen loaf of bread. Men wore them long and pointed. Women wore lace, edged ones tied under the chin. Everyone looked faintly absurd, but vanity melted somewhere between frost and fatigue. The bedding itself was a feat of Victorian engineering. First came the straw mattress, then layers of coarse linen sheets, then the heavy wool blankets, and finally a patchwork quilt or two. Some families even spread old coats on top. The bed was a fortress, a cocoon against the slow predatory cold that pressed against the windows. Once inside, you barely moved. Shifting even slightly let the warmth escape, and regaining it could take an hour. But warmth alone wasn't safety. There was another enemy in the night moisture. The body's own breath condensed on cold surfaces, creating a thin film of frost that crept across windows, furniture, even hair. Some mornings people woke to find their pillows stiff with ice, or their blankets damp at the edges. The bed, sweats and freezes, wrote one London diarist in 1873, and I do the same. For the poor, the situation was grimmer. They slept in shared rooms, 2 or 3 to a mattress, sometimes more. Beds were rarely washed. The straw inside was reused season after season until it smelled of mildew and ash. Lice were constant companions, as were rats seeking crumbs of food or bits of warmth. Families living in cellar rooms often slept beside buckets of coal or sacks of potatoes because they were in a cruel sense warmer than the walls. You can picture a mother pulling a child close, whispering lullabies through the sound of dripping water and the faint scuttle of mice. For the middle class, there was the illusion of comfort. Feather mattresses, heavier curtains, perhaps a small fire in the adjoining sitting room, yet even they shivered beneath their civility. Bedrooms weren't heated. That was seen as unhealthy and morally suspicious, as if warmth itself might make one lazy or indulgent. Doctors claimed cold air purified the blood. The result was an entire nation lying awake, purified, blue and miserable. Still, Victorians found ways to make bedtime bearable. Books were read by candlelight, their wax dripping slowly onto the nightstand. People shared ghost stories, half to entertain, half to remind themselves that their own discomfort wasn't the worst fate imaginable. Some prayed, others just listened to the sounds of the house, the wood contracting, the wind whistling, the rhythmic tick of a clock. In that stillness the mind wandered. You could almost mistake the ache of cold for contemplation. And there was another layer to these frozen nights: intimacy. When warmth was scarce, closeness was currency. Husbands and wives huddled together more out of necessity than affection, though occasionally necessity turned into tenderness. The only fire in the room, wrote one anonymous poet, was the one we shared between us. Families, too, learned the choreography of shared warmth. Children nestled between parents, grandparents, tucked along the edges like sentinels against the draught. It wasn't graceful, but it was human. In boarding houses, strangers shared beds for a small fee, a shilling for a night's warm side. People pretended not to notice each other's breathing, or the way bodies instinctively edged closer as the night deepened. It was awkward sometimes, scandalous, but survival had no patience for propriety. The next morning they'd part without names, bonded only by the memory of borrowed heat. There were dangers, of course. Fires occasionally broke out when bed warmers or coals tipped over. Entire families perished in smoke-filled rooms. The newspapers were full of grim headlines: families suffocated in their sleep, flew left unattended. Yet even those tragedies did little to discourage the nightly ritual. The fear of freezing outweighed the fear of fire. Londoners were practical, like that tragedy was simply another expense of living. And then there were the dreams. Diaries from the era mention vivid, almost feverish sleep, perhaps from the combination of exhaustion, carbon fumes and cold. People dreamed of warmth summer gardens, golden sunlight, glowing hearths. One factory worker wrote that she dreamed of lying on a beach so hot it hurt. Another man described recurring visions of candles melting endlessly, their wax dripping into rivers of light. Maybe the mind, desperate for comfort, built its own warmth when the body couldn't. Still, there was beauty in those quiet hours. The frost traced delicate patterns on the window's lace made by winter's invisible hand. The faint glow of moonlight spilled across the floorboards. Somewhere outside, a horse's hooves echoed faintly on the frozen street. Inside, someone turned over, sighed and slipped into uneasy dreams. The house creaked. The fire murmured and time itself seemed to slow, as if even the world had curled up for the night. By morning the window panes were opaque with ice. The first breath of air was a shock-sharp metallic alive. People woke slowly groaning as they emerged from their quilted cocoons. The floorboards bit at bare feet. The water jug was frozen solid. Someone downstairs struck flint to relight the fire, the spark briefly illuminating a room full of frost and hope. Historians often romanticize those scenes, the candlelit beds, the soft hush of snow outside. But behind the poetry was pain. The cold was constant, relentless, yet somehow it bound people together. Warmth wasn't just temperature, it was community, family, the fragile magic of shared endurance. So, as you settle deeper into your own warm bed tonight, think of them, those Victorian sleepers cocooned beneath mountains of blankets, their breaths fogging the air, their hearts beating steady beneath layers of wool. They didn't dream of comfort. They dreamed of morning of firelight, of one more day to keep moving through the cold. And in that small, stubborn dream they found something remarkable, the courage to keep breathing even when the air itself seemed to turn against them. If you picture the Victorian winter as a frozen nightmare of soot and silence, you wouldn't be wrong, but you'd be missing something. Because amid the cold, people still went out. They still went to work, to church, to the theatre, and most absurdly to parties. The Victorians believed that social duty didn't hibernate. No matter how the frostbit life and fashion marched on. Step into a London street at twilight. The snow glows faintly orange under the flicker of gas lamps. A procession of carriages moves slowly through slush wheels, creaking like ancient bones. Inside each one, a world of lace, perfume, and pretense shivers beneath the illusion of elegance. The passengers are wrapped in velvet, their breath clouding the glass, their cheeks pale with cold and powder. You can almost hear it, the faint jangle of harness bells, the crunch of hooves on ice, the muffled cough of a coachman trying not to freeze to death. For the upper class, surviving winter wasn't enough. It had to be done beautifully. Women wore gowns of silk and taffeta layered under furs so heavy they could barely walk. Their faces glowed from the cold or perhaps from the brandy discreetly sipped before leaving the house. Men wore tall hats and polished boots, their coats lined with beaver or sable. It was a competition of endurance disguised as grace. Behind every genteel smile was a silent mantra: don't let your teeth chatter. Inside the ballrooms, chandeliers blazed with gaslight, the air thick with warmth, perfume, and conversation. Ladies fanned themselves, claiming the room was stifling, though every glance toward the frosted windows betrayed the truth. Violins played skirts, swept laughter, rippled like candlelight. Yet even here winter crept in the faint draught along the floor, the smell of damp wool beneath the perfume, the occasional sneeze muffled behind a lace handkerchief. Fashion during the Victorian winter was an art form built on contradiction. The wealthier you were, the less practical your clothing. Layers of silk corsets, feathers and lace, none of it insulated, all of it expensive. To be seen shivering in style was proof that you belonged. The poor wore wool and flannel. The rich froze in silk and called it refinement. But beauty had its dangers. Frostbite didn't discriminate. There are stories of debutantes fainting in their carriages after long rides home from the theatre, their hands pale and stiff despite satin gloves. Doctors wrote about winter palsy, nerve damage from prolonged exposure to cold. Yet the next evening the same carriages rolled out again. Appearances mattered more than pulse, and for those who couldn't afford furs or servants, there was another kind of nightlife, the tavern glow. You can see it now, a narrow door spilling yellow light into the snow laughter, and music leaking out like warmth itself. Inside, men crowded shoulder to shoulder drinking cheap gin that burned like fire. The smell of smoke, sweat and spilled ale clung to the walls. Outside, frost painted every window with delicate flowers mocking the misery beyond. Here warmth wasn't elegant, it was communal. People shared it, through laughter, through breath, through the simple nearness of other bodies. Sailors told stories, labourers sang, women hawking matches warmed their hands by the stove. The laughter wasn't joy exactly, it was rebellion, a noisy middle finger to the cold. Theatres too offered temporary refuge. Audiences packed into dim rooms heavy with smoke and perfume. The heat of so many bodies made the air thick and restless. Patrons shed gloves and scarves, fanning themselves as the actors shouted on stage. Outside, the frost continued its quiet conquest, coating the streets like glass. When the curtain fell, everyone bundled up again, stepping back into the cold world that waited patiently for applause to end. And then there were the Christmas gatherings, the one time when all classes shared, however briefly, the illusion of warmth. Charles Dickens made sure of that. His stories of redemption and roaring hearths were propaganda for kindness in the bleakest season. Families decorated evergreens with candles, a tradition both charming and highly flammable. Children hung stockings near fireplaces, where sparks leapt like mischievous fairies. The smell of roasted chestnuts drifted through alleyways. For a few short days the city pretended it was merry, but step outside those homes and the illusion shattered. Beggars huddled near bakery vents, their fingers black with frost. Workhouse doors closed early, their rooms already full. Even on Christmas Eve, some froze quietly in alleyways while church bells rang overhead. God rest ye merry gentlemen, the carolers sang as if the words could warm the dead. It was a cruel paradox. London glittered most brightly when it was darkest and coldest. For every waltz beneath chandeliers there was a child outside, pressing her hands to the window for a moment of stolen heat. The Victorians knew this contradiction. They built their literature, their charities, even their self-image around it. The cold made generosity fashionable. No season brings out the moral character of man more clearly, wrote a preacher in 1881, than the winter, which is a poetic way of saying the rich felt guilty when they saw their breath on the same frosty air as the poor. Still, something about the cold softened the city. It slowed its heartbeat. The usual clatter of hooves and wheels gave way to muffled silence. You could hear your own footsteps echo. Even the Thames, that grey vein of industry, seemed to pause under its thin crust of ice. Night stretched long stars wavered in the smoky sky, and people, for all their differences, shared one quiet truth. Everyone wanted to be warm. In paintings from the era you can see it. Figures huddled by street lamps, faces half lit by the soft orange glow. Women clutching their cloaks, men pulling their collars up. The cold blurred the lines between class and character, turning everyone into silhouettes moving through the same fog. It was strangely beautiful, a kind of melancholy unity, and so the Victorians kept moving. Through snow, through fog, through frost and fatigue. The city was an organism too stubborn to sleep. Every step, every flicker of light, every song echoing through a frozen alley was proof of that resilience. They didn't conquer the winter. They simply refused to bow to it. As you picture it now, the glittering carriages, the taverns alive with song, the lonely figures beneath the street lamps, you can almost feel that cold pressing in. It's sharp, yes, but it's honest. And maybe that's why they endured it so fiercely. Winter stripped away pretense. Beneath the fur and silk, beneath the soot and shivering, every heart beat the same way, steady, stubborn, human. The night deepens. The lamps flicker. Somewhere in the distance a piano plays through an open window. And for a brief, impossible moment, London doesn't feel cold at all. It feels alive. Beyond the glittering carriages and ballroom laughter, another London existed, the one hidden in alleyways and workhouses, where survival wasn't about fashion or pride, but about sheer endurance. If the upper class faced the winter with discomfort, the poor faced it with terror. The cold didn't just bite, it devoured. You step off the bright street, leaving behind the perfume and the sound of fiddles, and turn into a narrow lane. The air changes instantly heavier, sour, alive with smoke and despair. The ground beneath your boots crunches not with snow but with frost-covered refuse. The smell of coal dust and sewage clings to everything. Between the buildings you see movement, hunched figures wrapped in tattered shawls, faces pale beneath layers of grime. A woman huddles with her child under an archway, both of them wrapped in a burlap sack once used for flour. The child's breath fogs faintly in the air. The mother's doesn't. This was winter for the working class, a season not of wonder, but of counting how many nights one could make it through. The lucky ones had tenement rooms, damp, crowded and dark, with frost blooming on the walls like a second wallpaper. The unlucky ones found shelter in doorways under bridges or inside the public spike houses, grim institutions where a night's warmth cost your dignity. Men queued for hours outside clutching tin cups for soup. Women and children were sometimes turned away entirely. The workhouses were worse. A place of refuge, the government called them, but everyone knew the truth. They were punishment disguised as charity. Imagine walking into one on a January evening, the smell of sweat and bleach, the echo of coughing in a long, cold hall. The walls sweat moisture, and the air feels heavy with hopelessness. Meals are thin gruel breadwater. Fires are rationed, and blankets are scarce. If you're caught lingering too close to the kitchen stove, you're scolded for idleness. Warmth is a privilege, not a right. Children barefoot and coughing were expected to work through the season sweeping chimneys, cleaning streets or running errands for pennies. Many slept in sheds or under carts, burrowing into piles of straw like small animals. There are records from the 1,840 seconds describing boys frozen to death in Street Giles and Whitechapel curled up in corners, as if asleep. A constable would find them in the morning, brush the snow from their hair and move on. There were too many to mourn. Even indoors, the cold was merciless. You'd think the crush of bodies in a tenement might bring heat, but all it brought was stale air and sickness. Families of 6 or 8 shared one room. The walls were slick with condensation, the ceiling black from coal smoke. When frost crept in, it didn't just cover windows, it formed on the inside of the door, sealing the family in with their own breath. Babies slept in drawers or crates lined with rags. If the fire went out, mothers pressed their children to their chests to share body heat whispering stories through chattering teeth. Doctors called the winter illnesses the poor man's plague. Bronchitis, pneumonia, tuberculosis, they swept through the city like wolves. Medicine was expensive, and charity doctors few. Some families burned old shoes to keep the fire going long enough to boil water for tea because hot water at least felt like medicine. But amid the hardship, there was resilience, a quiet, stubborn kind of courage. People learned to make warmth from whatever they had. Old newspapers stuffed into shoes, straw tied under shirts, rag rugs layered on the floor to stop the drafts. Women made penny blankets out of scraps of cloth, sewing each piece by candlelight until their fingers went numb. They shared recipes for soup that could feed 10 mouths from one bone. And when the cold became unbearable, they gathered together, telling jokes and stories until laughter itself became a kind of heat. One social worker of the time wrote, "They suffer as a body, but they comfort as a family." In the poorest quarters of London, warmth was communal. Neighbours knocked on each other's doors, carrying small tins of coal or inviting children to sleep closer to their own hearths. There was no charity in it, only understanding. Tomorrow they might be the ones in need. Still, the city was brutal. The Thames, swollen and sluggish, froze at its edges. Barges were trapped in ice. Dock workers lost wages. Chimney sweeps, unable to climb when the soot turned to black frost, were dismissed until spring. Even grave diggers had trouble breaking through the frozen ground, and funerals were delayed. London became a city on pause. Breath-held heartbeats slowed. In the slums, the sound of frost cracking along roof beams became a nightly chorus. Water froze in pipes and shattered them. Windows already patched with paper buckled under the weight of snow. People grew superstitious. They said the frost was alive, that it crept through streets like a ghost, slipping beneath doors to steal your breath while you slept. Jack Frost, they called him a name, whispered with both humour and fear. The newspapers romanticised it, of course. They wrote about the beauty of the frost in Whitechapel, as if the glitter of ice on broken glass could disguise the hunger beneath it. Wealthy Londoners took sleigh rides through Hyde Park, laughing under fur blankets, while only a few streets away men scavenged for firewood in the gutters. One editorial even suggested that the poor benefited morally from hardship. History has never lacked imagination, especially when it's comfortable. Yet even here in the city's coldest heart, hope survived in small, flickering ways. Soup kitchens opened. Churches rang their bells for late-night shelter. Strangers slipped coins into frozen hands. Every act of kindness became its own kind of firelight. Brief, fragile, but real. You can see it if you close your eyes, the smoky glow of a candle in a cracked window, the faint hum of voices sharing warmth in the dark. A little boy asleep beside a dying fire, clutching a coal shovel like a teddy bear. A woman whispering to her child that spring will come soon, a lie told tenderly enough to feel true. The poor didn't just endure the winter, they shaped its soul. Their struggle became the conscience of an age. Every charity drive, every Christmas story, every painted image of goodwill to men was born from the sight of them. People who had nothing but still found ways to keep each other alive. And when the frost finally began to melt, when the gutters filled with grey slush and the city's breath warmed again, London moved on. The rich threw open their windows, celebrating the sunshine. The poor cleaned their hearths, counted their scars, and prepared for the next cold season that would inevitably return, because that was the unspoken truth of Victorian life. Winter never really ended. It only paused. The cold lived on in the bones, in the lungs, in the way people looked at each other, grateful, wary human. When winter wrapped England in its icy grip, the Victorians didn't just battle the cold outside, they wrestled with it inside their very bones. There was no electric blanket to crawl beneath, no central heating humming softly in the walls. There was only faith firelight, and the stubborn human instinct to survive one more night. For many, the line between warmth and death blurred under the flicker of a candle, and in that uncertain space, people turned to something older than science belief. Faith was in its own way the Victorians' most enduring blanket. Churches filled in the cold months not just out of devotion but out of desperation. The pews were crowded with shivering figures wrapped in wool and hope. The breath of hundreds rose together, fogging the air like incense. Outside, snow drifted quietly through the graveyard. Inside, the minister's voice echoed like a spell. The Lord will provide. In a sense, he did. For many, faith offered warmth where fire could not. The act of prayer itself, hands clasped, eyes closed, was a small act of defiance against despair. Hymns rolled through the chill like waves of comfort. Abide with me, they sang, voices trembling, fast falls the eventide. In that melody, the frozen world softened. People weren't just pleading with heaven, they were reminding themselves that they weren't alone. But religion wasn't always gentle. The Victorians, with their iron morality, often linked physical cold to spiritual weakness. The poor were told that suffering purified the soul, that endurance in hardship was holy. The frost tests the heart as fire tests gold, one preacher declared in 1860. It was a poetic way of saying endure your misery quietly. Warmth like salvation was something you had to earn. Doctors offered little more comfort than the clergy. Medical science was still half alchemy, half imagination. Hypothermia wasn't fully understood. Catching cold was believed to come from sin as much as from weather. Remedies ranged from absurd to dangerous mustard plasters, burning vinegar fumes, or swallowing hot gin mixed with pepper. There were even pamphlets advising that rubbing snow directly on frozen skin could stimulate the moral fibers. It mostly stimulated screaming. Those who could afford it sought warmth through contraptions and cures, charcoal foot warmers, steam baths, electrical blankets powered by primitive batteries, all promising relief, all slightly terrifying. A few wealthy eccentrics turned to spiritualism, claiming that seances generated energetic heat. Imagine a parlour full of people holding hands around a table shivering as a medium declares, "Do you feel that the spirits are among us?" "Yes, madam, and they've brought a draught." For the working-class faith took simpler forms. They lit candles before icons carried rosaries in their pockets, whispered small blessings over the fire before sleep. They prayed for strong backs, healthy children, a merciful thaw. Some believed that frost had souls, mischievous spirits that could be bribed with breadcrumbs left on the sill. Others hung iron keys or spoons above doorways to confuse the cold. Folklore mingled with faith until every hearth became a shrine. Winter also reshaped community. Church halls opened their doors as shelters. Chapels organized coal drives. Parish nurses walked miles through the snow to deliver broth and medicine. The dividing line between divine mercy and human kindness blurred. In one letter from 1872, a London vicar wrote, "It is God's will that we warm each other." That sentiment, half theology, half practicality, became the heart of winter charity. But belief was also personal, often fragile. Imagine a mother kneeling by her child's bedside, the small face flushed with fever. The candle trembles, the frost creeps up the window, and she whispers a prayer that mixes fear and faith until even she can't tell them apart. The doctor may not come, the coal may run out, but she keeps praying, because in a world where every breath fogs and fades, belief is the one thing that can't freeze. And then there were the superstitions, strange, comforting, sometimes grim. People placed bread on the table overnight for the spirits of the cold. Some burned herbs like rosemary and thyme to invite warmth spirits into the home. Children were told that snowflakes were the footprints of angels, proof that heaven hadn't forgotten them. Even death had its rituals. Bodies were laid by the fire before burial, so that the soul might leave in comfort. The Victorians found warmth even in mourning. Historians still debate how much of this was faith and how much was survival instinct dressed in poetry. But to the people living it, there was no difference. Belief was practical. It filled the silence, gave meaning to pain, and turned the frost into something that could be spoken to, negotiated with. You couldn't reason with winter, but you could talk to it, bargain with it, pray through it. And in a strange way it worked. Communities built around churches tended to survive winters better. People checked on one another, shared food, shared stories. The act of gathering, of singing together, eating together, even just sitting side by side in the cold created warmth more real than fire. The Victorians didn't call it body heat. They called it fellowship. Outside, though, faith was harder to keep. The streets were littered with reminders of failure. The dead cart rolling quietly at dawn, the frost-covered shapes in alleyways. Preachers tried to frame them as martyrs of poverty, but people knew better. They were just unlucky or forgotten. Still, someone always stopped to cross themselves, to whisper a prayer, to pull a scrap of cloth over the face. Even death was given dignity by ritual. In the countryside, where winters could be even harsher, faith intertwined with nature. Farmers read the frost like scripture. A white dawn brings a fair day. They told stories of Jack of the Snow, a spirit who danced across the fields at night, sealing them in silver. Children left small offerings of milk outside barns, believing it kept the frost from killing the animals. It was half belief, half insurance. You can almost see it now. A candle flickering in a cottage window, a figure kneeling beside the hearth, the whisper of prayer barely audible over the crackle of coal. The wind moans through the chimney, and for a moment it sounds like an answer. Faith didn't melt the snow or fill the coal scuttle, but it did something subtler. It kept people moving, breathing, hoping. It turned suffering into story, and story into strength. When science failed and money vanished, belief stayed. Not because it was logical, but because it was warm. So tonight, as the world outside your own window grows still and dark, think of them, the Victorians whispering psalms into the cold lighting candles with trembling hands, finding light in the breath of one another. They didn't pray to be warm, they prayed to be unbroken, and somehow, against every frostbitten odd, they were. While London shivered under its smoky sky, life in the countryside was a different sort of cold, quieter, deeper, and more personal. Out here, winter didn't feel like an inconvenience. It felt like an occupation. The frost came early, and once it settled, it ruled everything. The air, the ground, the rhythm of life itself. You wake before dawn in a farmhouse miles from the nearest village. The world outside your window is still blue and silent, as if someone pressed pause on time. The panes are laced with frost so thick you can't see through them, only pale light filtering in like a ghost's breath. The only sound is the groan of wood contracting in the cold. When you finally step outside, the chill doesn't greet you, it claims you. In the city, people battled cold with coal and company. In the countryside, you fought it with the land itself. Wood, hay, animal warmth and grit. Farmers rose, long before the sun stomping across frozen earth that cracked beneath their boots. The smell of smoke clung to their coats, and their hands, red and cracked, already ached before the first shovel of the day. There was no luxury of waiting for warmth. The animals came first. The barn was the real hearth of winter life. Cows, horses, sheep, their breath turned to mist rising in clouds that hung beneath the rafters. The animals huddled close together, steam rising from their flanks, the smell of hay and manure filling the air like an earthy incense, and the farmers, despite the stench and the noise, loved it. It was life noisy, warm and honest. In cottages, warmth was an art of compromise. The hearth was the centre not just of the home but of existence. It burned with peat or wood instead of coal, and its smoke often filled the single room where the entire family ate, worked and slept. The fire wasn't elegant, but it was faithful, a small pulse of heat that somehow kept everything going. You can picture it, the mother turning a pot of porridge, her cheeks pink from the glow, the children crouched nearby, tracing patterns in the ash, the father mending a boot by the light of the flames. Outside, the fields slept under a sheet of frost. Crops were gone, animals thinned from slaughter, and what remained was endurance. Rural winters were long, sometimes 4-5 months of grey sky and white ground. Travel was limited. Isolation was constant. Roads froze, rivers crusted with ice. Letters came rarely, and news even less. Villages turned inward, surviving together on stories and stubbornness. Evenings were sacred. The family gathered close to the hearth, telling tales to drown out the wind. Folk songs filled the dark, slow and rhythmic, like breathing. There were stories of ghostly travellers frozen in the snow, and spirits who guarded the hearth. Children listened wide-eyed, clutching their blankets, half afraid, half comforted. Fear, after all, was warmth in disguise. It made the blood move. The countryside had its own superstitions. People nailed horseshoes above their doors to ward off frost spirits. A broom placed upright by the fireplace was said to confuse the winter witches. On the coldest nights, some left bread and ale by the doorstep for old Jack of the Ice, a folkloric trickster who might otherwise creep in and steal your fire. The rituals were old, maybe foolish, but they gave people something the cold could not take, a sense of control. But even superstition had limits. When the woodpile grew low, when the smoke from your chimney dwindled to nothing, there was nothing left to bargain with. Families rationed heat the way they rationed food. Fires were banked early, and everyone went to bed soon after sunset. Blankets became fortresses, dreams an escape. You learned to listen to silence, to the way frost cracked on the roof, to the faint sound of an owl calling across empty fields. It was lonely, but not empty. The countryside had its own voice, soft and ancient. Some nights the sky cleared. The stars burned sharp and endless, their light glinting off the snow like shards of glass. The moon turned the fields silver, and the whole world looked peaceful, though that peace could kill you if you mistook it for gentleness. In those moments people felt small but connected. The same stars shining over London's chimneys shone here too, over barns and frozen streams and silent woods. It was the one shared luxury of the poor and the rich alike, the sight of the universe so cold and beautiful it almost felt warm, and yet there was joy in it too. When the thaw came, even a brief one, it was like a resurrection. Children ran barefoot through slush, animals bellowed happily, and the river sang again. Fires burned brighter, and meals seemed to taste richer. Winter taught people to notice things they otherwise ignored. The smell of bread, the sound of laughter, the softness of another person's hand. When everything is frozen, even small mercies glow. Historians often say that rural England in winter was more peaceful than London, but peaceful was just another word for forgotten. If the city's cold was noisy, the countryside's was quiet, an endless slow endurance that wore down even the strongest hearts. But there was dignity in that struggle, a kind of unspoken nobility. No one was there to applaud you for surviving another storm, but you survived anyway. The Victorians wrote endlessly about moral strength, about discipline and virtue. Yet the real lessons came from these people far from parliament and parlours. Farmers who rose every day to break ice for their horses. Mothers who saved their last log for a sick child. Old men who stared into the frost and said nothing because there was nothing to say. They didn't talk about perseverance. They lived it. So when you think of the Victorian winter, don't just picture the foggy city. Think of this: the quiet fields, the single light in a distant cottage window, the faint glow of a fire that has burned all night because someone refused to let it die. In that glow lies everything: exhaustion, faith, hope and love, stubborn as the land itself. Children of the Victorian winter grew up learning the language of cold long before they could read or write. To be born in that era was to inherit frost as your first teacher, a presence that shaped how you dressed, how you moved, and even how you dreamed. Their world was small, often confined to a single smoky room or a street lined with frozen puddles, yet their imagination ran wild because there was little else to keep them warm. Picture it: a London alleyway at dawn, the fog thick enough to taste the air biting against tiny faces wrapped in mismatched scarves. Children scurry barefoot or in worn boots, stuffed with paper-carrying tin pails or scraps of firewood. Their laughter sounds thin like glass, fragile, bright, and quick to shatter. They chase each other through the frost breath, puffing in small clouds that vanish into the grey. For a moment, they forget the cold. Most of them didn't go to school in the winter. The walk was too long, and the classrooms too cold to be worth it. Even the lucky few who did attend sat in unheated rooms, ink frozen in their bottles, fingers so stiff they could barely write. Teachers encouraged hardiness, which was Victorian code for no one's lighting the stove. Some lessons were cancelled not for snow, but because the students couldn't stop coughing. At home, warmth was rationed like food. Families often kept the youngest children closest to the fire, their small bodies wrapped in hand-me-down shawls or bits of old blankets. Babies slept in drawers or baskets lined with rags. When wood ran out, mothers burned anything: furniture, legs, old boots, even the straw from bedding. They'd do it quietly while the children slept, so no one could see the heartbreak of survival. But children had a resilience that adults envied. They turned hardship into games. The older ones learned to slide down icy streets on bits of wood, shrieking with laughter while dodging carts. Others built snowmen that leaned like drunks, decorated with coal eyes and carrot noses borrowed from tomorrow's dinner. In rural villages, kids made frost toys, delicate leaves or feathers dipped in water, and left to freeze into glittering ornaments. By morning they'd hang them near the hearth to watch them melt as if releasing the night's spell. Still, winter left its mark. Illness followed them like a shadow. Sore throats turned to coughs. Coughs to fevers. Chest complaints doctors called them a phrase so vague it covered everything from a cold to tuberculosis. Milk soured quickly in cold kitchens and vegetables froze in the larder, leaving meals thin and grey. Children grew pale and small, their bones showing through threadbare sleeves. Photographs from the era show them standing solemnly beside fires, faces, half-lit eyes far older than they should be. Yet there was also tenderness. Parents, for all their weariness, did what they could to shield their children from the worst of it. Fathers built small screens from old boards to block the draught by the bed. Mothers rubbed chapped hands with tallow and wrapped feet in wool rags before sleep. They told stories, endless stories, to distract from hunger or the cold. Fairy tales were powerful medicine. A story about magic fires or kind ghosts could keep a child calm through a freezing night. And sometimes the smallest kindnesses came from strangers. Wealthy benefactors distributed Christmas bundles, parcels of socks, mittens, or boiled sweets. Churches opened for hot tea and hymns. A single orange was enough to make a child's entire week. The cold made every gesture magnified. Even a match struck in the dark felt like mercy. In the countryside, children worked alongside adults feeding livestock, fetching water, breaking ice in troughs. They wore boots, too large, sleeves too short, but they sang while they worked, breath visible in the air like the smoke of tiny chimneys. Some helped warm newborn lambs by holding them inside their coats. Keep them breathing, their mothers would say. It was good advice for everything in winter. Nighttime brought its own ritual. After the day's work, families gathered by the fire if there was one, and the children curled together under blankets that smelled of smoke and straw. Some fell asleep mid-story, others whispered secrets in the dark. The youngest might wake in the night crying from the cold, and an older sibling would wrap them closer, shushing them softly. Even poverty had its lullabies, but not all children had that comfort. Thousands lived on the streets, orphaned or abandoned, their nights spent in doorways or under bridges. They slept in pairs or groups, pressed together for warmth, stealing scraps of coal from delivery carts to sell for food. Newspaper reports told of urchins frozen where they lay, found curled like sparrows in the morning. It horrified the middle class briefly until the next frost came. Dickens wrote about them, of course, and his words stirred pity for a time. But the problem was too large, too constant, too cold for outrage to last. And yet the children who survived carried something fierce within them. They became the chimney sweeps, the errand boys, the nurses, the builders of the next generation. The cold taught them lessons no school could: how to share warmth, how to endure, how to keep a spark alive in the bleakest dark. The winter shaped them not kindly but thoroughly. When spring finally arrived, those same children were the first to celebrate it. They danced barefoot in muddy streets, splashing through puddles that glittered like glass. They picked the first flowers to bloom through frost, small defiant things no bigger than a fingertip, and placed them on windowsills like trophies. The adults smiled, tired but proud, because if the children had survived another winter, it meant hope itself had survived. So when you think of the Victorian winter, don't just picture the men by the hearth, or the women stitching by candlelight. Remember the children red-faced, shivering, laughing through clouds of breath. They didn't conquer the cold. They played with it, talked to it, dared it to take them, and somehow they always found a way to stay alive long enough to see the thaw. When darkness fell early and the wind began to hum across the rooftops, families gathered around their hearths like moths around a flame. Outside London was a world of rattling shutters and echoing footsteps. Inside, the only sound was the soft murmur of fire and the quiet rhythm of stories. Victorians didn't just endure winter, they filled its silence with words. The nightly ritual was simple. The fire was stoked, candles trimmed, and everyone found their place. The father might polish his boots or read the newspaper aloud, his voice steady against the wind. The mother mended clothes or peeled potatoes, her fingers moving automatically, her thoughts elsewhere. Children sat cross-legged on the floor, eyes bright, waiting for the moment the chores ended and the storytelling began. It always began with a sigh, that deep, satisfied sound of settling in. Now then, someone would say, "Have you heard the one about the man who met death on the frozen road?" Or, "Let me tell you how your grandfather survived the great snow of 47. The tone was half warning, half lullaby. The fire popped. The room leaned closer. Victorian fireside tales were a peculiar mix of comfort and terror. Ghosts, frozen travellers, mysterious knocks on the door, all reminders that the world outside was vast and merciless. Yet somehow, those stories made the night feel safer. Fear told aloud became entertainment, and laughter melted its edges. The children would gasp and giggle as the storyteller lowered his voice, letting the wind outside fill the pauses. Not every tale was spooky. Some were simple village memories, harvest dances, old romances, bits of gossip turned legend by repetition. In rural cottages, people recited folk songs, their melodies rising and falling with the flames. The rhythm of the music matched the rhythm of life, slow, steady, enduring. Even the simplest rhymes sung in unison could make the smallest cottage feel like a fortress against the cold. The fire itself was part of the story. It shifted and sighed like a living thing. Shadows played on the walls, twisting into shapes that seemed to dance with the words. Sometimes the flame burned blue and someone would mutter that a spirit had joined them. It was half superstition, half hope. A reminder that warmth like love was shared with both the living and the dead. Children often fell asleep to these sounds, the crackle, the whisper, the creak of the house as it settled. Their dreams mixed with the stories, and by morning no one could quite tell where the fiction had ended. A girl might wake believing she'd seen a ghost by the window. A boy might swear he heard sleigh bells from the sky. The cold gave imagination room to grow. In the cities, the poor had their own version of this ritual. They gathered not in parlours, but in workhouses, taverns and shelters. Someone would light a stub of candle or toss a scrap of wood into a communal stove, and the stories would begin rougher, shorter, often true. Tales of street fights, lost jobs, miraculous luck. A man might describe the time he found a shilling in the gutter and ate meat for the first time in months. For those audiences, hope was the only believable fairy tale. Writers of the era understood this power. Dickens, of course, turned storytelling itself into warmth. A Christmas Carol wasn't just fiction. It was a lifeline, a promise that even in the deepest frost kindness could thaw the world. His stories echoed what people already believed in their hearts, that generosity was heat and cruelty was cold. Readers cried over Scrooge's transformation because secretly they wanted to believe it could happen in real life. And perhaps in small ways it did. After a story, someone would always stir the fire, pour another cup of tea, or share a bit of bread. Words softened the air. They made people gentler. The act of listening together, of breathing in rhythm, hearts synced to the crackle of wood, was warmth enough. By the time the last log turned to ash, the room would be quiet again. The children would be asleep, the parents half dozing. The world outside remained the same, cold, vast, indifferent, but inside there was peace. The flames glowed low, and for one soft moment the house itself seemed to sigh. That was how the Victorians survived the longest nights, with stories, with songs, and with the simple, miraculous act of staying close. They couldn't stop the cold, but they could tell it to wait a little longer. Step beyond the warm glow of those fireplaces, and you find the other side of the Victorian night, the streets where warmth was a privilege, not a promise. The farther you wandered from the polished neighbourhoods of the wealthy, the more the city changed its face. Gas lamps flickered uncertainly in the fog, their light stretching into thin golden veins that bled into the dark. You could hear everything: the distant clop of hooves, the cough of a night watchman, the slow rattle of a cart carrying goods or bodies through the frozen streets. In the shadow of the great city, countless people had no home to retreat to. Vagrants, widows, orphans, they filled the alleys like ghosts that refused to die. Some huddled in doorways wrapped in newspapers. Their figures so still that morning patrols sometimes mistook them for rubbish. Others crouched under bridges, where the cold wind off the Thames felt like a living thing crawling across their skin. There were men who carried flasks of gin not for pleasure but for survival drinking until their veins felt like fire. It kept them alive for an hour, sometimes less. Workhouses turned people away when the beds were full, and the shelters charged pennies for standing room only. Penny sits, they called them long halls, where the poor could lean against ropes, strung from wall to wall, resting upright because lying down was forbidden. Imagine it, hundreds of people asleep while standing, breathing the same smoky air, the ropes creaking under the weight of their exhaustion. When the morning bell rang, they untied the ropes and swept everyone out into the frost again. The cold didn't care who you were. Even the strong broke under it. Dock workers, coal men, street sweepers all earned just enough to buy warmth one night at a time. And when the cold stretched for weeks, when the ice on the Thames refused to melt, debts piled up. Families pawned their blankets, then their coats, and finally the clothes off their backs. By February, the city was full of barefoot children and shivering women, selling matches on corners that no one wanted to stop at. And yet, the winter also revealed something strangely tender in the city's heart. The Salvation Army, barely a new idea at the time, opened soup kitchens that glowed like small miracles in the fog. Charitable ladies handed out bowls of stew and pieces of bread, their gloved hands trembling as they passed them through the crowd. For a brief moment, charity looked like love. For a brief moment, it almost was. Sometimes warmth came in unexpected places. In pubs, people pressed together not just to drink, but to share heat. A man might pay for a round he couldn't afford just so no one would ask him to leave. In cheap lodging houses, strangers shared beds lying head to foot to save space. There were unspoken rules: don't steal, don't cough too loudly. And if one person found a bit of warmth, the patch of sunlight through a cracked wall, a coal still glowing in the grate, they'd share it. Because in the cold, kindness was more contagious than disease. Still, the contrast between the classes was impossible to ignore. While the rich toasted brandy in parlours and complained about the picturesque frost, the poor froze outside their gates. Newspapers ran sentimental essays about the beauty of winter, complete with engravings of rosy-cheeked skaters. Few mentioned that those same skaters glided over a river that had claimed dozens of lives, bargemen trapped beneath the ice women who slipped while fetching water. Beauty in the Victorian age was often another word for blindness. Artists painted it, of course. The frozen Thames, the snow-covered rooftops, the glow of lanterns through fog, all so serene on canvas, so silent. But silence in the city was never peace. It was hunger, exhaustion, and resignation. The frost made everything still because everything was too cold to move. And yet, even in this bleakness, London refused to die. Its pulse beat through the footsteps of those who walked all night simply to stay warm. You can imagine them now, a man pacing back and forth under a bridge. His shoes soaked his breath, forming clouds. A woman humming softly to her child, her voice a lullaby against the wind. Somewhere nearby, a lamplighter tips his hat, and for a moment their eyes meet a small flicker of recognition in the endless dark. Historians write about the industrial progress of that century, about inventions and empire, but they often forget the simple miracle of endurance, the millions who faced every winter and still found ways to greet the dawn. For the poor, hope wasn't abstract. It was practical. It was a fire that didn't go out a stranger who shared bread, a single candle that burned all night because someone shielded it from the draught. The snow might have covered the city, but beneath it life never stopped. The baker still lit his ovens at dawn. The milkman still made his rounds, his cartwheels crunching over ice. Children still found ways to laugh, even if their breath froze mid-air, and when the first light of morning finally spilled across the Thames, even the cold seemed to hesitate just for a moment before retreating. Because no matter how harsh the winter the people of Victorian London carried their own small suns, they glowed faintly in the dark in songs, in kindness, in stubbornness, and that glow, fragile as it was enough to make the city breathe again. For every fire that glowed through the long Victorian nights, there was a doctor somewhere, writing confidently about how to cure the cold. Medicine in the 1800s was an odd mix of real progress and creative nonsense, and winter was its favourite testing ground. When the frost crept in and the coughing began, Victorians reached not for tissues but for tonics, tinctures, and the occasional miracle wrapped in lies. You wake up in a narrow bed, your throat raw, your nose burning your chest heavy as stone. Outside, the fog presses against the window like a living thing. The coal fire sputters, and you feel that familiar dread, the fear that this cough won't go away until spring if it ever does. Somewhere downstairs your mother is already mixing something foul-smelling in a teacup, muttering that it worked wonders for cousin Margaret. You don't argue. No one does. In the Victorian winter, survival meant swallowing whatever promised heat from the inside out. The most common prescription for winter: chills, alcohol, and plenty of it. Doctors recommended brandy for sore throats, whiskey for frozen nerves, and gin for anything that made you cough. The theory was simple: if it burned, it must be healing. Many Victorians began and ended their days with a medicinal sip, which often became a habit less medical and more enthusiastic. There were recipes for hot wine laced with pepper, for rum mixed with honey and vinegar, and for something ominously named Dr. Bentley's liquid courage for catarrh. Children weren't spared either. Cough syrups routinely contained opium or morphine. One popular brand, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, promised to calm the nerves and ease the chest. It did permanently in some cases, but parents desperate to let their children sleep through the night poured it freely, never realizing that each teaspoon carried the weight of silence. Not all Victorian remedies were deadly, some were merely absurd. To prevent frostbite, women rubbed their faces with goose, grease, or whale oil. Men stuffed their shoes with onions to draw out the chill. Another cure involved wrapping mustard-soaked cloths around the chest and waiting for the humours to leave the body. It worked in the sense that you'd be too busy screaming from the burn to notice the cold. Doctors argued fiercely about the nature of winter illness. Some believed colds came from bad air miasma, that invisible swamp gas of sin and sickness. Others blamed moral weakness. A few insisted it was divine punishment for vanity, especially for women who dared attend evening parties in low-cut dresses. Their advice: dress modestly and repent. It was the kind of diagnosis you could expect from a man wearing 3 waistcoats and never leaving the fireplace. Still, medicine was changing. The late 19th century brought the first whispers of germ theory. A handful of scientists, mocked at first, began to suspect that invisible creatures, not cold air, caused disease. They invented disinfectants, early vaccines, and mouthwashes that smelled like paint thinner but sometimes worked. Soap sales skyrocketed. Households were told to scrub everything: tables, windowsills, even the air. Cleanliness became the new religion, and the middle class embraced it with zeal. To wash is to live, one health pamphlet declared, conveniently sponsored by a soap manufacturer. In hospitals, though, winter was still a season of dread. Wards overflowed with coughing patients. Nurses moved like ghosts through rows of iron beds, carrying buckets of steaming water and linen soaked in carbolic acid. The smell was sharp, chemicals strangely reassuring. Outside carts lined the street, waiting to carry away those who hadn't made it through the night. But for most people, medicine remained homegrown. Families swore by their own secret cures, onion poultices, salt gargles, boiling lemons with cloves and sugar, until the entire house smelled like desperation. Grandmothers recommended hot bricks for the feet and prayer for the rest. Even faith healers found business-booming itinerant magnetizers promised to channel invisible warmth through their fingertips for a small fee. Whether it worked didn't matter. Hope, after all, was its own sedative. And then there was the strangest treatment of all air bathing. Health reformers insisted that sleeping with the window open even in midwinter built character and cured everything from melancholy to weak lungs. Magazines published earnest essays titled "In Praise of the Cold Bedroom," so families cracked their windows convinced that a bit of frost on the pillow was preferable to moral decay. The result? More coughs, more deaths, and one particularly ironic headline in 1889 Doctor Who advocated window sleeping dies of pneumonia. Despite the madness, some remedies truly helped. Wool undergarments prevented frostbite. Steam inhalation eased congested lungs. And when the fever finally broke, people recovered slowly beside the fire, sipping broth wrapped in blankets that smelled faintly of soot and salvation. Doctors might have claimed credit, but it was warmth, simple human warmth that healed most ills. Even as medicine stumbled toward science, Victorians clung to ritual. They lit candles for the sick, whispered prayers, and believed that care itself could ward off death. In the end, maybe it did. Because the real cure for the Victorian winter wasn't in a bottle or a tonic. It was the hand that poured it, trembling but kind. If you could step quietly into a Victorian bedroom on a freezing night, you'd find a scene that feels strangely intimate. Two figures under a mountain of blankets, sleeping side by side, breathing in soft rhythm with the crackle of the last few coals. But don't be fooled by the coziness. Sleeping arrangements in the 1800s were rarely about romance or rest. They were about rules. The Victorians treated even bedtime as a matter of etiquette, propriety, and moral order. In small cottages, families shared beds because there was simply no other choice. A single mattress might hold parents, children, and sometimes even boarders. Modesty was a luxury. Warmth was the priority. The poor slept fully dressed boots, and all because undressing in an unheated room was an invitation to illness. Still, there were unspoken courtesies. No one stole the middle spot unless invited. No one kicked. And if you turned over, you warned the others first. Turn if you're turning, to avoid losing the collective warmth. The middle class, though, turned sleeping into a performance. Bedrooms were meant to reflect moral discipline. Husbands and wives were expected to sleep separately if the house allowed his room and hers connected by a door for visits. Shared beds were considered slightly indecent, too suggestive of passion. Even in marriage, restraint was virtue. To sleep apart, one etiquette manual declared, is to preserve both health and dignity. It sounds cold because it was. For couples who did share a bed, there were rules there too. You didn't lie too close unless you were ill. You didn't talk once the candles were out. And you certainly didn't allow your toes to wander onto your spouse's side without invitation. Bedtime was a choreography of manners. One turned, the other followed, both pretending that comfort was less important than composure. The wealthy had entire rituals built around sleep. Servants warmed sheets with pans of coals and laid out embroidered nightshirts. Silk curtains enclosed the bed to keep out draughts and symbolically sin. Women wore high-necked nightgowns buttoned to the throat. Men long cotton shirts with stiff collars. Some couples prayed together before retiring. Others read scripture aloud, as though divine words could banish the sound of wind clawing at the windows. But below that refinement, the body still whispered its own needs. Cold has a way of breaking down pretension. Many marriages that seemed polite by daylight became unexpectedly tender by night when warmth demanded proximity. Hands found each other under the covers. The cold turned touch into necessity. Even the most pious could forgive themselves for reaching across the line when the frost crept through the floorboards. For servants and the working poor there was no such formality. In boarding houses and factory dormitories, people shared beds with strangers, sometimes 6 to a room. Privacy didn't exist. Survival replaced modesty. You could feel their breath, wrote one mill girl from Manchester. But better breath than cold. Diseases spread easily, of course, coughs, lice, even smallpox, yet no one dared sleep alone. The silence of isolation was colder than any draught. Children especially shared beds by age or gender. Sisters slept side by side, beneath patched quilts, whispering secrets, until the dark swallowed their voices. Brothers huddled beneath coats, their dreams stitched together like the rags that covered them. The smallest ones were placed between older siblings, tiny hearts beating fast against the sound of the storm. In that closeness was a strange, innocent comfort, the kind that never quite left them even as adults. In hospitals and boarding schools, sleeping arrangements reflected hierarchy. The wealthy students got thick mattresses, the poor straw. Patients in crowded wards slept inches apart, curtains barely concealing the fact that one might not wake by morning. Night nurses made their rounds by candlelight, checking pulses, tucking blankets tighter around the living. The beds looked peaceful, but the air was full of sighs. Etiquette books fretted about everything from how long one should nap no more than 1 hour, lest it breed idleness, to the proper way to breathe during sleep with serenity, the mark of a moral mind. There were even guides on correct dreaming. Fantastical dreams, they warned, revealed a restless imagination ill-suited to duty. One wonders what they'd say about the countless Victorians dreaming of beaches and sunlight while wrapped in 12 pounds of wool. But the truth, the quiet, unspoken truth, is that sleep was one of the few moments when pretense dropped away, when faces softened, hands unclenched, and even the most self-controlled souls let the cold and the dark claim them. It was paradoxically the most honest part of the day. Whether you slept in a silk bed or on a straw mat, winter made everyone equal in stillness. And in the rare, gentle hours before dawn, when the fire had gone out and the air grew sharp again, people often woke for a moment, half conscious, half dreaming. They'd listen to the breathing beside them, the soft creak of the house, the wind pressing like a hand against the window. Some would whisper a prayer, others would simply reach out, touch another hand, and drift back into sleep. That touch, small, quiet, human, was worth more than any etiquette or luxury. It was the one warmth that couldn't be rationed, taxed, or extinguished. And for all their rules and rituals, the Victorians understood that. Beneath the starch and lace, beneath the sermons and science, they knew that the simplest truth was this: no one survives winter alone. By the late 19th century, something quietly revolutionary began to creep into those cold Victorian bedrooms, a small rubber miracle that would change the way people slept, the hot water bottle. It seems like a humble object now, a comfort item for sick days or rainy nights, but in the Victorian world it was salvation disguised as plumbing. To a society that had spent centuries shivering through winters with bricks, coals and prayers, it felt almost magical warmth that didn't smoke, burn or kill. Before rubber, early hot water bottles were clunky contraptions made of copper tin or earthenware. They were filled with boiling water and sealed with corks, then wrapped in rags or placed inside quilted covers. Some were shaped like flasks, others like flat discs. The wealthy used ornate ceramic ones, decorated with flowers or initials, heating them by the fire before slipping them into bed. The poor made do with whatever they could: beer bottles, stone jugs, even old kettles. The danger was obvious. One wrong seal, one careless bump, and the night's comfort became a scalding disaster. But the risk was worth it. A bit of heat against cold sheets was the difference between sleep and hours of trembling. When rubber manufacturing improved in the 1,890 seconds, the true revolution arrived. Flexible, safer and far easier to fill rubber hot water bottles became the unsung heroes of the industrial winter. Advertisements promised domestic sunshine and gentle warmth all night long. The tone was almost spiritual, as if the product itself carried grace. Some even named their bottles, affectionately passing them down like heirlooms. "Old Betty keeps me alive," one miner reportedly said, referring to the battered rubber shape he carried home each night. The ritual of preparing one was sacred. In houses where fireplaces had gone cold, someone, usually the mother, would boil water in a dented kettle, the hiss filling the small kitchen like a hymn. She'd pour carefully into the bottle, steam curling around her hands, then press it to her cheek to test the heat. Too hot and it burned, too cool and it failed its purpose. Once the temperature was just right, it was wrapped in a flannel cloth and tucked beneath the covers, leaving a warm dent where someone's body would soon rest. Children would race for it, laughing each, wanting the spot where the heat was strongest. It was the one moment of pure luxury the day allowed. Letters from the time describe the joy of those first few seconds in bed, the shock of icy sheets giving way to gentle warmth, the tension melting from tired muscles. It was intimacy without touch, a promise that at least one thing in the night would be kind. People began giving hot water bottles as wedding gifts, hospital donations, even tokens of affection. A rubber bottle, unlike flowers or letters, carried weight quite literally, and it meant care. Of course, being Victorian, they turned even this small comfort into etiquette. Women's magazines advised proper placement for health and modesty. Bottles should warm the feet, not the stomach. Children should receive smaller ones to preserve their innocent circulation. A few doctors worried about over-dependence, insisting that too much artificial warmth weakened the constitution. One stern editorial in the Household Guardian even warned, "He who trusts the bottle over the blanket invites frailty of spirit." Yet behind the caution was quiet gratitude. People knew better. For once, progress truly served the poor as much as the rich. In hospitals and workhouses, these bottles became precious currency. Nurses used them to revive fainting patients or soothe frostbitten limbs. Soldiers returning from cold campaigns called them comforts of civilization. Even factory workers pooled money to buy one for shared use, passing it between them during breaks like a relic of survival. It wasn't just about heat. It was about dignity, about reclaiming a little control in a world where so much was dictated by the weather. Children adored them most. Many named theirs Pip Little Furnace Mr. Toast. They'd whisper secrets to the bottle, hug it through the night, and wake up clutching it like a pet. For the first time, the poor and the wealthy alike could wake to sheets that weren't frozen stiff. The frost still came, but it no longer had quite the same power. Over time, the humble invention became symbolic, a quiet victory of human ingenuity over nature's indifference. The Victorians had learned how to trap sunlight in rubber, how to carry warmth from the fire into the bed, how to make nights survivable. It didn't end poverty or disease or loneliness, but it softened them. And maybe that was enough. Because when you think about it, the hot water bottle was more than an object. It was a small, glowing metaphor for the entire Victorian struggle. They lived in a world that could be merciless, but they found ways to make it gentler. One invention, one act of kindness at a time. You can still find them today unchanged in design, a shape of simple comfort, handed down from a century that knew more about cold than we ever will. They remind us that warmth is rarely free, but always worth the effort. So as the kettle hisses and the night deepens, imagine yourself there in a narrow London room, the frost crawling across the window, the last ember fading in the grate. You pull the bottle close, feel its steady living heat against your skin, and breathe out a long, contented sigh. The winter is still fierce, the world outside is still frozen. But in your hands there is proof that even in the darkest century someone somewhere thought to make the night a little kinder. Morning in a Victorian winter didn't arrive gently. It crept in like a thief, grey and uninvited. The first light was thin and cold, sliding across the frost-glazed window like a dull knife. Inside, everything felt brittle. The air, the sheets, even the sound of movement. You could hear the boards creak under every step, the faint hiss of the dying fire, the rustle of blankets being pushed aside. No one wanted to rise first, but someone always had to. The servant, the mother, the one who knew that the fire downstairs had gone out hours ago and must be coaxed back to life before anyone else dared leave their bed. Her breath fogs in the stairwell as she moves through the darkness, one hand on the wall, the other clutching a candle. The house feels like stone. In the kitchen she kneels by the hearth, scraping cold ashes, striking flint until a single spark takes. The flame blooms, weakly hesitating, then grows, licking at the coal like a sleepy animal. It's the sound of the city waking up, one hearth at a time. Upstairs, children murmur beneath heavy quilts, reluctant to move. The father coughs into his handkerchief and groans, muttering that even his bones feel frozen. The water in the basin has turned solid again. Washing your face meant cracking ice and pretending it didn't sting. By the time everyone gathered for breakfast, the smell of smoked tea and damp wool filled the room, an aroma that somehow meant comfort. Outside London stirred in the pale light. Chimneys belched ribbons of grey into a sky the colour of pewter. Street vendors called out through scarves wrapped around their mouths. Horses slipped on the cobblestones. Milk froze in bottles before delivery. But there was rhythm in it, a strange mechanical beauty. The same city that nearly froze its people also taught them how to keep moving. Factories roared to life. Workers filed in breath, rising in unison. Shops opened. Church bells rang muffled by the fog. The frost glimmered on rooftops and iron rails like a second sunrise. For a moment, everything seemed still not dead but waiting, and then quietly warmth began to spread again. From 100,000 small fires from stoves and forges, bakeries and kitchens, light began to pulse through the city. You could almost see it from above, a slow bloom of orange in the grey, a living heartbeat returning to London. For the Victorians, surviving the night was victory enough. They didn't expect comfort. They expected endurance. Yet every morning carried a quiet triumph. The fact that they had made it through another cold night, that their fires still burned, that their breath still misted in the air. So as the city exhaled and another day began, people wrapped themselves in scarves, pulled on gloves, and stepped back into the cold. The frost still bit, the wind still howled, but life went on stubborn as ever. And in every pale sunrise reflected off a frozen window there was a promise whispered in smoke and breath. Alike, we are still here. By the time winter loosened its grip, the Victorians had learned once again how to live with the cold, not to conquer it, but to exist beside it. The thaw came slowly, quietly. Snow turned to slush, the rivers cracked and groaned, and the air began to soften. For weeks people moved cautiously, as though afraid to believe it was over. And yet, under every dripping roof and steaming chimney, a strange calm settled, a calm born of survival. The city began to breathe again. The market stalls returned, brimming with colours that had been absent for months. Oranges, fish bread still steaming from the oven. Street musicians played in the open air, their fingers red and raw but quick with life. Even the fog felt lighter, less oppressive, as if the smoke itself had decided to forgive. London was never a kind city, but it was alive, and that was enough. In the countryside, thaw meant movement. Farmers unbolted barn doors, swollen with ice. Fields long buried in frost revealed themselves like forgotten memories. Sheep blinked in the sunlight, steam rising from their wool. The rivers sang again, and with them came birds shy, cautious, returning. The first shoots of green pierced through the grey earth, fragile yet defiant, and everyone noticed. After months of monochrome, even a blade of grass felt like a miracle. People changed too. The same faces that had looked pale and weary in December now carried a quiet pride. They had made it through another season, another test. In a world without safety nets that was no small thing. They carried scars, coughs, and memories of bitter nights, but they also carried stories. The Victorians didn't just endure, they remembered. And in their remembering, they built a kind of wisdom that would outlive them. Writers of the time captured it best, that mix of gratitude and melancholy that lingers after long suffering. They wrote of how frost revealed character, how cold shaped kindness. Winter refines the soul, one poet said, for only in the absence of warmth do we learn what truly warms us. It was sentimental perhaps, but not wrong. The harshness had stripped away the unnecessary, leaving behind something purer, the small, persistent goodness of people. In the end, that was the true warmth of the Victorian winter. Not the fire or the blankets or even the invention of the hot water bottle, but the human capacity to create comfort where none should exist. A mother's hand over her child's heart, a stranger offering half a loaf, neighbours knocking just to check the fire was still burning. These were the quiet flames that kept the empire alive through its coldest nights. And perhaps that's the lesson still worth remembering. We like to think we're far removed from them with our thermostats and glowing screens, but the truth is simpler. The world still gets cold sometimes, not in temperature, but in spirit. And like the Victorians, we're still searching for warmth, not from coal or fire, but from one another. So as the frost melts and the air grows soft again, imagine those narrow London streets, those quiet cottages, those tiny pockets of light. Each one a small defiance, each one a whisper. The cold will come again, but so will we.